All right, how do I look? Ready?
A little sweaty.
Post it?
He's eating paper! No!
There's a better place, one floor up. Today's the day. I'm gonna get the promotion. Does that mean this is my new office?
Not yet. I host a dinner once a month.
We can do Saturday.
It's not really a girlfriend type thing. You invite idiots to dinner and make fun of them?
Okay, that is messed up.
I know.
So you told them you're not going?
Oh, yeah. No, absolutely.
Why can't you just suck it up, make fun of some idiots?
Sometimes you have to do the right thing. Are you okay?
I saw this little guy in the street and I was trying to save him from masterpieces.
Amazing.
In the words of John Lennon, you may say I'm a dreamer, but I'm not.
The only one.
The only what?
That's the lyric. You may say I'm a dreamer, but I'm not the only one.
I don't think so, Tim.
Are you sure you want to do this?
That's what friends do.
Tim, I'd like to introduce my friend Louis and his wife Diane.
Your wife?
For now.
Dinner is served.
Mind control.
I am very, very powerful.
Best dinner ever.
Sometimes I think you think I'm an idiot.
Just stay in the chair.
Tim!
Teach us to love the way you loved us. Send us out, and pour out your fire and flow through our lives. Send us out, send us out.
All right, so what does Dinner with Schmucks have anything to do with Jesus? Well, as always, ride with me. Eventually it'll make sense, and hopefully it'll come to mind every time you think of the biblical story we're going to get to by the end of this morning. It provides the perfect backdrop, actually historically, for the context of what happens in John 13. But before I get to that, we've been talking in a series all summer long, if you've just been joining with us, about it factors. And basically, we've been looking at the life of Jesus from a different perspective. I mean, it's one thing to look at him and what he taught and what he said, but it's a different same thing to sort of figure out, like, how was he received? What was it about him that made people who were nothing like him want to be around him? What was it about him that has turned our whole world upside down? I mean, think of all of the things that today are commonplace, which we don't even realize came from Christ. As a matter of fact, last week, Pastor Bobby talked about the parable this teaching from the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus said, if somebody asks you to go 1 mile, then go with them a second mile. We talk about going the extra mile all the time in our society. Yet most people don't even realize that came from Jesus. And this morning we're going to be looking at something that came from Jesus as well, something called a servant leader. There was no such thing as a servant leader before Christ. Yet today, if you read business books, just about every business book that's talking about how to be a great leader, from a CEO down to a dishwasher, every one of them is going to espouse this idea of servant leadership. You can go to Jim Collins, who wrote Good to Great, who I think later wrote another book on leadership. And in that book on leadership, it's what's called, I know I have it in here. Now I'm like getting, Built to Last. In his book, Built to Last, he espouses the idea of servant leadership. And you go over to Ken Blanchard, who talked about 1 Minute Manager. What's he talk about? Servant leadership. You go to the who's who of leadership books, they're all going to come back and say, you need to be a servant leader. And where did this idea of servant leader come from? It came from Jesus. There was something different about him. There was something unique about him. And he was so different and so unique, the world didn't know what to do with him until many years later. And he has turned our entire world upside down, whether or not we acknowledge it or not. And in that day and time, I kind of want to look back and say, what if we were to do the things and live a life like Jesus? I think those same it factors would apply to the church, because we as the church are supposed to be a representation of Christ in the world. And I think the reason why we don't have the same impact on our city that Christ had on his city is because of the it factors about Jesus, not because of the teachings of Jesus. Because I see most churches are teaching what Jesus taught. We're just not living out those little things like Jesus lived out. And one of those we're going to look at this morning is what it means to be a servant, what it means to be a servant leader. And if you study ancient Rome, if you study ancient Greece, the Greco-Roman worlds were sort of overlapping around the time of Jesus. Alexander the Great swept over the entire world in around 308 or BC. And from that time until the rise of Rome, which was happening around 100 BC or so, and on in, there was the Greco-Roman civilizations were overlapping. That's why in history you may study Greco-Roman world. So the Greco-Roman world, they had ideas of what made someone great. And Jesus was not a great man at all. I mean, if you looked at him and judged by the standards of his day, he was not considered a great man. And it wasn't until many years later that people looked back and understood the greatness that Jesus had. But in his day and time, he was not great. What was great in the Greco-Roman world was that of a hero, one who overcame, one who rose above the struggles, one who raised themselves from here to here. And we still, it's funny because even the Greco-Roman ideas continue on to our days. And although we are influenced by Christ, we're even, I think, stronger influenced by the Greco-Roman ideals. The Olympics came from the Greco-Roman period, actually the Greco period. Is it Greco period? The Grecian period? I don't know what you'd say. Anyways, they came from Greece. And the whole idea of the Olympics was they were actually to them a religious ceremony. Why? Because these were the heroes. These are the ones who had overcome. These are the ones who had risen above against all odds. These are the ones who were to be celebrated because they came out on top, and they were victors, and there were victors, and there were losers. As was it Bob Yeti? Who was the guy from Wide World of Sports who'd say the thrill of victory and the agony of who was that said that? Crickets. Come on, you guys never watched Wide World of Sports? Anyone? It was a show on ABC long before ESPN. Anyways, okay, I'm losing y'all. Maybe I'm too old now. I don't know. What? Is that him? Okay, I did not know that. All y'all know the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air theme song, but none of y'all know Wild World of Sports? Okay. I am getting too old. I didn't think I was that old, but I guess I am. But for the Greeks, there was the agony of defeat. That word agon comes from the Greek. Agony comes from the Greek. There was the agony of defeat, and we still think about the agony of defeat. And you were trying to strive always to get ahead. And so that's what was lifted up. The Greeks knew what greatness was, and for greatness for them had nothing to do with humility. Humility was not a value at all in that day in society. The Roman world was very similar to airlines. I guess that would be the closest, either airlines or the high school lunchroom. I don't know which would be a better comparison to the Greco-Roman world. If you've ever been to your high school reunion, you relived all of those same anxieties from the high school lunchroom, right? When you go to the buffet at your reunion, where do you sit? Well, they were cool in high school, but he doesn't look so cool now. She was real popular, but look how she turned. I don't know. Is she still a popular one? You don't really know what to do when you go to those things. All those same anxieties come back over. Where do I sit after I go through the buffet line? It's a crazy. Anybody all been to a high school reunion experience that? Okay. Airlines, though, are really big. Their whole business model is built around status, right? There's first class, then there's coach, and then there is the business class, which is sort of first class, and there's coach. And then even Southwest, which doesn't have first class, they still have their sort of elite members who get to board first. Did you know if you're an elite member of Southwest, you don't have to stay up 24 hours before your flight? Like if your flight leaves at 12 noon, you can register for your flight the previous day at 12:01. Did y'all know that? And so you're like getting there so you can get in Group A. Well, you know if you fly with Southwest a lot, you get the privilege of automatically getting Group A. You can actually pay a little bit extra for the privilege of automatically getting Group A. The whole structure of airlines is all about status. Even when you sit in coach, they sort of do everything they can to let you know you are not equal with those in front. As a matter of fact, they would not even prefer to fly with you, but since they have to, we'll just put the curtain up between the two of you so you can't look and see what's going on in there. They purposely make you walk the walk of shame as they're sipping on champagne in these wide seats. You have to like sort of fumble past them and look and see what they're already enjoying. You won't get a drink for another hour and a half at least. And if you want champagne, you'll have to pay for it. We do everything we can in those situations. That's the way the whole Greco-Roman world was ordered. There was levels of status. At the top, of course, was Caesar. Below Caesar was the senators. There was about 600 senators back in that day and time. And they were the who's who of their day and time. They're the ones who ran things in the Greco-Roman Empire. Below the senators was the equestrians, those who were wealthy enough to own horses. And this may sound foreign to you, but back in that day and time, your mode of transportation was a way that you would show your status. I mean, that's kind of foreign idea to us, but they would have this idea that if how you got from one place to another, your status. And so there was the equestrians. They were very wealthy, and they would ride around on horses, and when they would go into battle, they would have their horses, things like that. Then below them, there were the decurions, very similar to the 80s band, the DeLoreans, only it was called the decurions. And these are the ones who were the wealthy citizens who occupied government offices, or even some of the clergy members. That's right. That's right. Actually, I remember reading a book many years ago when I was in high school talking about how those of low class, the only way they could get anywhere close to the upper class was to become a doctor, a lawyer, or a clergyman. And when I felt God called me to ministry, I was like, hey, I get to be moving up. Anyways, I digress. And within this decurion class, there was what they referred to as the race for honors, where each one of them be trying to outdo each other. And it's really funny because on the outside looking in, nobody sees this. But once you get into any realm of life, there's a pecking order. Like you may look at somebody and say, wow, look at them. They own their own business. Like they own their own Chick-fil-A. And then you talk to that guy and he's like, well, yeah, I've only got a small store. This guy over here, he's got 3 stores. You talk to the guy who's got 3 stores, what's he thinking? Yeah, well, I don't have a whole region like, Fred up the road does. The guy, well, I don't have, a whole state like somebody else owns. Even within these classes, there was still a pecking order about who was who among things. It even happens in pastors as well. And I remember, I get sucked into this too. And I remember I was at a conference once, and so it was early on in our development as a church, and amazing things were happening and still are. But back then, it was like we were like 2 years in, and we were at this conference, and I took our leadership team there, and we had sort of a breakout session with just our leadership team. I was like, yeah, we're sitting right behind this church. They're amazing. And I started going on and on about their staff. I'll never forget Sherry Brunner, who's our church administrator. She looks at me and she goes, wait a minute, I thought our church was doing amazing things. Like we're not, was that all a lie or what? And I was sort of like, busted. And it was almost like I'd gotten caught up into this rat race where, if you're in the top 20%, you're comparing yourself to those in the top 10%. If you're in the top 10%, you're comparing yourself to the top 5%. So that's what they would do within this upper class here. And then the rest of humanity, I love this. Don't you love it when you turn something into whenever you turn something into Latin? I always think of Wile E. Coyote because they always show Latin in Wile E. I'm the only one. Okay. You guys are leaving me hanging everywhere this morning. The personas mediocribus. Doesn't that sound like something you'd see written on Wile E. Coyote? Personas mediocribus. That pretty much describes us, right? That was the other 98%. They were the nobodies. They were the rabble of society is what they would often be called. And they served a great purpose. The rabble served the purpose of letting those who were of the upper class know that they were upper class by comparing themselves to the rabble that was below them. And there was the nobodies of the empire. Even within this class of nobodies, there were better nobodies than other nobodies. There were nobodies who were citizens of Rome. And many times Paul talks about how he is a citizen of Rome. And then below those who were citizens of Rome were the freedmen. You may not have been a citizen, but at the very least you were a freedman. And below the freedmen, then of course, were the slaves. And that was the lowest rung of anybody in society. And even within the slave category, there were many rungs of slaves. Those who were of higher worth and dignity and value, and those of the lower worth and dignity and value. And so they would have all these different distinctions of that, and they would do everything they could to constantly reinforce these classes of people. Just everything you can think of, they would do. And it's funny how, as much as we've progressed as a society, it's really funny how close we are even to the Greco-Roman world idea of elite and status. They would use clothing to delineate who was and was not elite. Now, of course, in our day and time, anybody can wear whatever they want. We see that on Facebook, distributed all over. However, the only way that we can sort of delineate class now is by wearing outfits that are so expensive nobody else could afford them. That's about the best way we can delineate class now. And some things are so expensive they look ridiculous. You say, why would you wear that? Because it's Versace. Like your clothes and your shoes all have certain names that most people don't even know the definition of, right? And I'm like, whatever that means. Is it on the clearance rack or not? That's all I care about. My wife gets on me for shopping at Kohl's, but oh well, I am what I am. So what you would wear would delineate your status. If you were a freedman, you could wear a freedman's cap. And if you were a slave, you could not wear a freedman's cap. I thought it was a very interesting side note. Over in India, there's a very similar thing. I once was in a hot tub with a guy wearing a turban. Which, it sounds like the beginning of a great joke, doesn't it? So I was in a hot tub with a guy wearing a turban. It was just me and him, and we were all alone, and it was just kind of one of those things where when you're in a hot tub, there's sort of that intimacy that's sort of like by default has to happen. I mean, you're going to talk, right? I mean, you can't sit in a hot tub with another dude and not bridge that awkwardness in some way. And after we talked, made small talk for a little while, I just felt the freedom to ask the question every one of you have always wondered when you walk through the airport and see a guy wearing a turban. You've always want to walk up to him and say, hey, what's with the turban, dude? Because seriously, if you're in a hot tub wearing a turban, there's a level of commitment there that you didn't realize existed, right? And so I just had to ask. I was like, okay, you're in a Speedo and a turban. Explain this to me. And he told me, he said, over in India, only the elite noble class could wear a turban. And when there was a revolution that broke out, this group rose up with a different religious system because the Hindu system pushed so many people down, just like this Greco-Roman system, that this group called that they developed their own religion called Sikhs. And so Sikhism. And one of the tenets of Sikhism is they wear a turban. And it was a way to say, gosh darn it, we are somebody. And so they will show that they are somebody, even to the extent they'll wear a turban and a hot tub and a Speedo. And I was like, well, man, you are proving a point. I always get nervous about those guys in the turban. I get nervous about those guys in the turbans. I don't know if that's just me. I don't know. But by the way, Sikhs also always carry a knife, just so you know. That's part of their thing because the police would not defend them. Believe it or not, they actually lived in a society where police would not defend certain people. I don't know. It's interesting. So I digress. So, boy, I'm getting on touchy subjects this morning. But it comes back into tone here. So anyways, moving on. Also, if you were a citizen, so if you're a freedman, you could wear a freedman cap. If you were a citizen, you could wear a, come on, toga. Yeah. And if you've ever worn a toga, you don't need to tell us about that story, but you know how difficult it is to wear a toga. And I used to think in college I was just not doing it right. No, they were just that difficult to wear. As a matter of fact, to properly wear a toga, you would have to use one hand to hold it, which nobody in college realized that. Everybody's sitting there trying to cinch these things. I believe there was actually slaves whose sole purpose for wealthy people was just to dress them in togas because they were experts at the art of toga. Where was that guy at that frat party, right? But the togas were very difficult to manage, but they were a symbol of status because you could say, I am a citizen, so you were allowed to wear a toga. And so you actually had to have one hand holding your bed sheet, and you could only use one hand all day long. Imagine how uncomfortable that is. Could you imagine somebody wearing uncomfortable clothing just to show their that? Moving on. Again, I got to set the scene for you in the Greco-Roman world because it's very different than today, of course. And if you were a senator, you could wear a purple sash, kind of like a beauty queen, that would show nobility, that would show that you were of royal status. The senators could wear, and I don't know factually, you know how Jesus is always shown with a purple sash? I don't know if that's where that comes from or not, but it may be. I don't know. Anyways, but senators could wear the purple sash around their toga. Now, if you were one of the equestrians or decurions, you could not wear the purple sash, but you could wear a very expensive toga. And you could wear gold rings that would show your wealth. And now, if you remember over in James, he talks about showing favoritism to those who come in wearing fine clothes and gold rings. And he says, don't show special favoritism to those and not show favoritism to those who aren't wearing the toga and the rings, but treat them as equal. And James's idea was that there would be a cafeteria lunchroom where both the jocks and the nerds would sit together. That was his picture back in the day. And so they would use their clothes to show their status. They would also, their occupations were garnered around what rank they had. Of course, at the top of the rung were the wealthy landowners who would have many people working for them on their fields. The elite would never do manual labor. They would never lift a finger to do such a thing. It was said of Cicero, wrote, "Vulgar are the means and livelihood of the hired workmen whom we pay for manual labor." Now, I've heard two stories of Navy life. I've heard one story that says there's something called lean and clean on a ship. That's where the officers lean up against the wall and they don't help out. I actually had a friend of mine who said in her department it was so sort of strictly enforced that when she actually started to help clean the ship during a cleaning session, she as an officer, she was reprimanded by another officer saying, "You're not allowed to do that." Now, I've heard other people say that's not true in my shop. I don't know what is or not. I just thought it was very interesting that even that sort of idea that officers, we can't clean. Now, I'm going to hear all this back talk. I don't care. I'm just letting you know what one story I heard. Maybe it's different in your shop. That's great. Who cares? Anyways, legal condition reflected social status. I love this line here. It says, There was one law for the honorable and another law for the more humble. Or as the British would say, there's one law for the wealthy and there's another law for the poor. I'm glad we don't have that problem today. Anybody ever find it interesting that when like celebrities do jail time, like Lindsay Lohan, they have a separate jail cell for them? Or like when Paris Hilton, I think, got in trouble, she was allowed to like go home and she like served out the rest of her sentence at home because it was too expensive to keep her at the county jail for the accommodations that they had to make. Or when Dick Cheney shot a guy when they were on a hunting trip, they just let him go. I'll never forget Branford Marcellus on The Tonight Show. I think Jay Leno asked him, he's like, so if you shot someone in your neighborhood, they would let you go home and come back at a convenient time to question you, right? And he goes, yeah, that's exactly how it was in my hood. When I shot somebody, when we shot someone in my neighborhood, they would just give us the freedom to, take a few days before we talk to the police about it. I don't know, just found it kind of interesting. Moving on. Some of these things are a little too close to home, and some of y'all thinking I'm like, knocking on. I'm just saying, these were the things. I'm just telling you the Greco-Roman world. Things are so different today, I know. There were punishments exclusively reserved for slaves. One of them, of course, we know was crucifixion. That no citizen would ever be crucified. No freedman would ever be crucified. It was a punishment reserved just for slaves. Now, you could execute a non-slave, but you just would never do it in such a shaming, humiliating way as crucifixion. It was known as the slave's punishment. Titles were another indication of status. People loved to heap upon themselves titles. And it's funny, after Caesar rose to power and took power away from the Senate, the senatorial titles really were nothing more than a title. They gave them no power, but who cares? Why give up a good title when it's a good title? Because at the very least, it may not give you power, but it gives you status, right? And so they would hang on to them for these status ideas. One self-help book written by a Greek historian, Plutarch, was titled, How to Praise Yourself Inoffensively. If you could translate that, you could probably make money on Amazon with that same title, couldn't you? How to Praise Oneself Inefficiently. Another work from that time was called The Achievements of the Divine Augustus, written by Caesar Augustus himself. It was described on bronze tablets and distributed throughout his kingdom. And some of the excerpts from it were, just think about how this comes off in our day and time, because we now have the idea of humility. We at least sort of have the air that we want to be humble. We don't really practice it. We just sort of know it's a value we should ascribe to. And that day and time, it was so not even something they would ascribe to that somebody would be so crazy as to write a book that like this that has quotes in it like, 3 times I triumphed at oration. For goodness sakes, he's the stinking Caesar, yet he still feels the need to show all of his accolades. How ridiculous is that? 3 times I triumphed at oration. In other words, I gave speeches, and I was considered the best speech giver. 21 times I was named emperor. That's like Kim Jong-il saying, what do you know? I got elected emperor once again over North Korea. I mean, big deal. Anyways, he thinks it's a big deal even still. The Senate voted yet more triumphs for me, which I declined because of all the victories. There were too many. I had too many trophies on my case. I could not take any more accolades from the Senate, so I told them, no more, please. 55 times in my triumphs, 9 kings or children of kings were led before my chariot. It was a thing that where after his army would conquer a well-known kingdom, they would parade the foreign king in front of them to humiliate them. Why? Because I am so exalted. This great king that everybody knows is now bowing at my feet and walking before my chariot. See, once again, he's walking while I got my expensive ride. And he goes on to say, I've held the office of, here's another Wile E. Coyote phrase, Pontific Maximus. Isn't that just great? Almost sounds like a gladiator movie. I was the highest ranking senator for 40 years. Well, no kidding, you're stinking Caesar. All citizens with one accord unceasingly prayed in every holy place for my well-being. This almost sounds like Kim Jong-il. I don't know. Moving on. Please don't come after me. So anyways, moving on. Anyways, he goes on about his whole self-glossings. And it's in this day and time and world where the Bible writers such as James, who was the brother of Jesus, or Paul, who was himself a Roman citizen, would start off the things that they wrote by saying, I am a slave of Jesus Christ. Think about the title that they're giving themselves in a world that was all about titles and glossing who you are. They're saying, I am a slave of a criminal slave. Could you get any lower on the totem pole? Of a convicted, crucified slave who was humiliated in his slavery, and you're saying, I am a slave, I am beneath that guy, is where I am in my status. And you begin to see these little things we just read over in the Bible are profound in the day and time in which they came in. And so the status would continue to go down. Among pagan authors, studies written among pagan authors, humility was never a term of praise. It was always sort of looked at as being part of the abject and the ignoble and the unworthy, which is why when Jesus said something like this in Mark 10, you know that the rulers of this world love to lord it over their people, and the officials flaunt their authority of all those who are under them. Nobody would disagree with that. Even the other leaders would be like, yeah. And by the way, I can't help keep thinking of Donald Trump this whole time. I know I sort of like gave you a positive example a couple weeks ago, but is there anybody who espouses this better than him right now? Anyone? Anyone? Moving on. I like to talk about him because it keeps me from talking about me. Moving on. I know none of you all struggle with this issue. Just Trump does. Moving on. But he goes on, he says, not so with you. Instead, whoever wants to be great among you must be a servant, a slave. Whoever wants to be first must be your slave. So he's hitting the pecking order head on. He's saying, you all know how it is. Everybody knows that the whole point of getting up in the pecking order is that you have somebody to peck, right? And some of y'all get sick and tired of pecking and being pecked on. And your hope is that eventually you can be the one doing the pecking, right? I even see this with kids. They go to camp and they don't like the fact that the counselors are always telling them what to do. So what's their aspiration? To become a counselor. I remember when I was a kid, I wanted to be a counselor. You know why? So I could sit on top of the picnic table. You know what that is? Every time a kid sits on top of the picnic table, they're told not to it. And what does the counselor do when they come over to that picnic table? They sit on top of it. They justify it so I can see everybody. Right? I'm larger. I can't fit down in that thing. Moving on. Sorry, I digress. Only I struggle with these things. And so he says, just so the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. Now, we read through the Bible, and every time Jesus says something like this, we get it because we understand the concept of servant leadership. Yet we don't know why the disciples were so boneheaded as to not figure out what Jesus was about. We always wonder, why is it they didn't figure out that he came to die? Because in their day and time, they had no concept of somebody who aspired to be great ever humbling themselves in any way. When Jesus would say, I am going to humble myself, make myself as a servant, even to the point where I will allow myself to be crucified of a slave's death, they could not comprehend that at all. They thought that he was coming to be the president of the United States, and if you become the president of the United States, you would expect somebody to do the Trump thing, right? You would not expect somebody to say, I'm going to be humiliated and mocked by the entire nation. And that's what I've come to do. You're thinking, how then are you going to become president if you're going to do all of that? They could not figure it out. And don't chastise the disciples for not getting this, because this was their whole world and how they saw things. And they could not possibly comprehend Jesus ever aspiring to any kind of greatness if you were going to take this path down to being the lowest of the low of the low. Seating at public events, of course, reinforced status. Jesus even told some parables about this, about people come in always wanting the front seats. Front seats at their concerts were not dependent upon how much money you had. It would depend on what status you had. And so if you were of the highest status, you would get the best seats. If you were low status, you get the lowest seats in the back. And this carried on through many centuries. If you go back to why is it that there were those box seats at the opera, those high ones on the sides. Anybody ever sat in one of those? They're actually one of the worst viewing angles to watch a show. But you know why they were considered the elite place? Because you could look down upon everybody else, and everybody else could look to see who was up in the box. And even to this day, you know, when you go to a place like the Sandler Center or something like that, and you see somebody sitting up in the box, you go, oh, who's up there? And you think, how did they get that seat? Now, sitting up there, it's a horrible seat. I've sat up there for a couple of shows where it didn't really matter what it was. I was late getting tickets, so they're like the worst seats. People know they're the worst seats, but it's a status thing. And back in the day and the time, the peons in English world would be down there on a dirt floor, and it'd be dirty down there, but the elite would not associate themselves with those down there, and they would sit up in the upper status. Same idea in the Greco-Roman world, where your status depended on where you would sit for such events. And in this context, Jesus would say things like, who is the greater one? The one who sits at the table or the one who serves? This is over in Luke 22. Who is greater? Isn't it the one who sits at the table? I was like, this is a almost redundant question. I mean, it's kind of, everybody knows the one who sits at the table is the greatest one. And he says, but I come among you as one who serves. And they just could not comprehend this idea. This is him telling this before they get to the Last Supper, before they get to that time we're going to talk about in a minute. And this is where the dinner for schmucks thing comes in. Of course, whole idea of sitting. Did you know that back in the Roman world, one of the things that they would do is they would invite guests of inferior rank to come and dine with them for no other purpose than to show off their own status as being of more value than those other people. And what they would do is they would serve them something like Spam while they ate filet mignon, just so they could sort of ridicule the people at the table. Now, the movie Dinner for Schmucks is an interesting movie where basically they invite a bunch of really, in order to make the elite staff of the company, in order to be in the CEO, board of directors type level of this company, they have a dinner for schmucks like once a quarter or once a year where you have to go out and find somebody you can invite to this dinner, which everybody can secretly make fun of and feel better about themselves. And what's interesting about that is that movie, in our day and time, we watch it as part of us that goes, oh, I just don't like the concept of that. That's just so awful. Yet what better typifies America right now? Why do you think the airlines have elite status and first class? Why is it that we're all about getting bumped up? Why is it that we all care about where we sit at the high school lunchroom? Why? Because there's a part of us that, listen, I may not be the most popular kid in school, but at least I'm more popular than those kids. Or if you're part of those kids, at least you can be the alpha dog. Like, you could be president of the chess club, right? Because you may not be as status worthy as the quarterback of the football team, but being at least alpha dog amongst the nobodies is better than being a nobody, right? And so there's all these different classes. And so I show that dinner for schmucks because that was the world in which Jesus lived. And that was the world, and that is the reason why. Now you begin to understand why it is that the disciples, when Jesus is coming into Jerusalem, and they know that it's all about to go down, and he's about to confront Rome head on, and it's all going to come down this week. Now do you understand why they're having a discussion about who is the greatest? Because that's what everybody aspired to. That's what life was about. Life was a striving to become greater than where you came from. And along the way, somewhere, they begin to realize that Jesus was their meal ticket to greatness. Remember I told you could go from a nobody to a somebody simply by becoming a part of the clergy? Okay? Remember 2 weeks ago, I talked about how if a rabbi were to look to you and say, come follow me, you would instantly leave your nets and go follow him because the opportunity to become greater than where you had come from. And remember the dad in the movie was kind of like, where'd everybody go? But in reality, he'd be so excited because his son had gone from this lower class as a fisherman to the higher class of clergy. And so here's this rabbi who invites you into a higher class, and then you realize that this isn't just any rabbi. This is a rabbi who is going to take on Rome. He is the Messiah. He's going to become the leader. He's going to become a king like that of line of David. So of course you're naturally thinking, wow, how great am I going to get under this man? And the whole time Jesus is saying, no, we're going to be a servant. We're going to be a slave. You're like, what are you talking about? You're the Messiah. You're the king. You're of the greatest status. You're the King of kings and Lord of lords, and we get to serve you. And we're right under there. Just tell me, am I going to be the number 2 guy? Me? Who's going to be the greatest of us right here? And it's in that backdrop and context. After he's already told them, listen, who's the greatest one? The one at the table, the one serving? And they're like, yeah, whatever, okay. Yeah, who's going to be the greatest? And so it's in that context, with that backdrop, where he looks around the table and it says, he knew that the Father had given all things under his power, and that he had come from God and was returning to God. So he got up from the meal, and he took off his outer clothing. Outer clothing, what was that a symbol of? Your status. Remember, even Jesus had this like seamless garment that was, it wasn't a toga, but it was pretty cool even in that day to have a seamless garment. So he takes off his outer garment. He's taking off any status that he could possibly have. And he wraps a towel around his waist. He's now wearing the clothing of the lowest rung of a servant. And he poured water in a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet and drying them with the towel that was a part of his clothing. Remember, he's taking his clothing and he's wiping somebody's feet with that. Now foot washing in our day and time has almost become sort of like a cool thing or like a known thing. I don't know. It's just, we don't have the same idea of it. It'd be more of the equivalent in our day and time of cleaning toilets, cleaning babies' bottoms, showing up at 7 o'clock in the morning to unpack a trailer and being all hot and sweaty. By the way, if you saw Jeff Gladwell or John Murdoch or Chuck Bryan last week after they unloaded and reloaded everything from that trailer, they were sweaty messes. They did not look attractive for church. But I can imagine what they looked like in God's eyes, and that's where Jesus was at. Now, this was such a demeaning chore that no Jew would ever ask even a Jewish slave to wash feet. Do you get that? Even if you were the lowest rung of all Jews, you would still not be compelled by your master to ever wash feet. They would find some other non-Jew. Remember, I don't know if you read through the Bible, you'll see that the Jews had a way of looking down on other people who weren't like them. It was a weird thing. I know we don't do that, but they had that. So they would find a non-Jew slave that they would hire into the household for occasions like this to have them go do such a task. So not even a Jewish slave, but below a Jewish slave, a Gentile slave would be the one washing feet. And by the way, if you can think about other stories about like the prostitute who comes in and washes Jesus' feet and the guy's abhorred by it, and he's like, you didn't even have anybody come in and wash my feet. And so yes, she's even below that kind of thing. And so here's Jesus is taking the lowest of the lowest status, even below a Jewish slave, to wash feet. And it rocks their world. They have no idea. I got to share this one really cool story. We don't find any examples of this anywhere in history. The closest things we come to this is there was this Egyptian girl back in the days of the Pharaoh who says to her husband, I shall wash your feet. He says, no, we have servants for that. She says, no, I am your wife and you are my Lord, and no other woman shall ever wash your feet again. I love that story. It's beautiful, I think. Anyways. It's funny. Here's the thing. I say that sort of jokingly, and some of you are like, oh, no, he didn't. If he thinks I'm going to go do the lowest of lowest job, here's the thing. You women already do it anyway. Every guy I talk to, I just heard the other day, some guy said, I got to tell you, I had 4 kids, but I think I only washed 10 diapers my whole life, or changed 10 diapers. See, you already have your wife doing the foot washing thing. Now, you are all excited because you work out in the yard and work up a sweat. Who cares? I'm just saying. There's a lot of this foot washing still going on today, and sometimes we struggle about all of it. Anyways, moving on. So, back to this whole thing. So, Jesus would say, who is greater, the one who serves, the one who is serving? And what does he do? He goes out and lives out what he had taught them on the way to the dinner. And here was a thing. Paul said something about Jesus that nobody in the Greco-Roman world would ever in a million years do. It says Jesus, he referred to Jesus as Jesus in Philippians 2, he humbled himself. He humbled himself. And here we are 2,000 years later, and it's still hard for us to humble ourselves. I've never been a Gator fan at all, but I happened to become friends with Danny Werfel when I was in seminary because his girlfriend went to our school. And so it was kind of this really bizarre thing, having gone to Florida State. I mean, literally, we had just graduated. We had just played him in bowl games and stuff. And here I am a year later sitting on a couch watching Monday Night Football because he was playing for the Saints in New Orleans where I was going to school, looking across the room like, there's Danny Werfel. Oh, my gosh. Wow, okay. We're sitting there, and we're just talking one day, and he said, we were talking about, I was like, what's life like in football and stuff? And he's talking about, as a rookie, there's a lot of rookie hazing that goes on. I remember, was it Des Bryant recently, a couple years ago, said, I'm not going to carry anybody's shoulder pads. I don't do that. Well, they would do everything they could to demean a rookie. And every time they would go anywhere, the rookies would have to basically serve as waiters and as servants. And he said, as a Christian, because Werfel, as much as I hate Florida and everything that he represents, he's kind of like Tebow. He was like the Tebow before there was a Tebow. It's like, how can you not hate the guy, right? It takes a lot of effort, but you can do it. But he looks, he says, as a Christian, I had no problem serving. Because it was like everything they were forcing me to do, they were basically forcing me to take on the role that Jesus would take on the team. He says, but what I realized, even with my Christian ethic, the hardest thing for me was not serving the other guys on the team. The hardest thing was being treated like a servant by the other guys on the team. It says Jesus humbled himself, and he washed their feet. And he went to the cross and he died. And why did he do that? It says in the text, I don't have time to get into all this. He just says, there's two things we see in the book of John, chapter 13, right before he does the foot washing, two indications of why it is he would do this. It says in verse 1, he loved them to the end. Then it says in verse 3, Jesus knew that the Father had put all things under his power. He knew what his status was. He knew what his rights were. He knew what his authority was. He knew who he was. He had his identity from God, not from other people. He wasn't seeking it from status by other people. He knew who his status was before God. He says he knew that the Father put all things in his power, and he had come from God, and he was returning to God. This world is not all there is. There's a life beyond this life. He understood that this life is about nothing more than, can you say it with me, than giving the opportunity to choose to have a loving relationship with God that you will enjoy for all eternity. And it doesn't matter what people say about you, how they treat you, what they think of you. If you love people and you know where you're going and you understand you are loved by God and you have a loving relationship with him, and that 1,000 years from now, the only thing that's going to matter is what he thinks of you, and you will not care about what elite status or who's a who of what anything, what your title is, what your clothes are. You won't care about any of that stuff 1,000 years from now. It'll only be what God says about you. Jesus firmly understood that, which is why he could get up in that moment out of love for those around him, because he didn't care about status, what people thought about him, because he understood his status came from God. He could get up and serve humanity around him. And you and I have opportunities to serve the least of these, both within our church and outside the church, day in and day out. Right now, since 7 o'clock this morning, there's been people over there getting sweaty and nasty setting up a building. There's been people right now who are serving your children right now in childcare right now. There are people who are serving all over the place right now. Why? Because they know who they are and because they love. My question to you and to me is, I've been sort of saying it jokingly, we know our world, as much as we espouse the idea of a servant leader, there's a part of us, like Werfel said, want nothing to do with it at all. We almost want to be a servant leader just so we can get the status of being a servant leader. And Jesus is like, no, he was the lowest of the low. Paul said, my status is that of a slave of the slave. Would you join with me as we close?